you for Tamara and the Bloomfield Public Library for taking care of the tech here. This is not my comfort zone either. We're going to show the PowerPoint that I traditionally show in my presentations in person. I'm really excited to share with all of you my journey with Stella Prince, the only woman to serve as a lighthouse keeper at Horton Point Lighthouse in Southold, New York. The lighthouse is located on the North Fork of Long Island. We're going to get that PowerPoint up. Yep. Thank you, Mara. That is obviously a aerial view of the lighthouse. It is a beautiful spot. I want to invite you all. I generally ask at the beginning of the talk raise a hand, how many have been there, but I won't do that on Zoom here. But we are a landlocked lighthouse located in Southold. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, a little bit about how I came to write the book. I'll share a few passages from the book and some anecdotes along the way. It's been quite a journey that I've taken with Stella. First, the history of Horton Point Lighthouse. Horton Point is named after Barnabas Horton. He was the first owner of the property that Horton Point sits on. There were many owners after him. His final Horton, who owned the property, who inherited it from Barnabas, lost it in a gamble. So it then jumped around to a number of people before the federal government purchased it. Lighthouses are owned by the federal government. More and more now, historical societies or local governments are taking them over, sometimes even private citizens. Horton Point was commissioned in 1790 by President George Washington. Stay on the same slide. I'm sorry, you don't need to move forward. Go ahead back to the first slide. I'll tell you when to move it. Thank you. So President George Washington commissioned the lighthouse in 1790, the same year as Montauk Point Lighthouse, which is a very large lighthouse at the end of Long Island. Montauk Lighthouse was built within a year. Horton Point wasn't built until 1857, more than 60 years later. We don't know why, but we like to say that the federal government wasn't any more efficient then than it is now. Okay, you go to the next slide is the book. Here is a picture of my book, Stella Prince, the Lady Lighthouse Keeper. And the book is historical fiction. It is very much based on Stella's life and includes much of the history of the North Fork in the late 1800s and very early 1900s. Stella was born in October of 1867 in a small cabin in Southold. And she really went on to accomplish great things for a woman of her day. She was a role model even today. And her story continues to unfold, which I'm going to share with you as I go through this PowerPoint. But first, I'd just like to read my introduction that'll tell you a little bit more about the process that I went through to get the book written. As Ruth Ann said, I am a docent at Horton Point. I moved, I'll get into that later. Let me read this first. Sorry. At the end of my shift at Horton Point Lighthouse, I walk around the museum, turning off the lights that illuminate each display cabinet. In the small room with the images of the former keepers, I stop and take a long look at the photograph of Stella Maria Prince Terry. I wish she could speak to me. Stella, the only woman to serve at Horton Point, remains a bit of a mystery. She lived there more than half her life, longer than anyone ever has, and yet there is little factual record of her time there. I searched the archives of local historical societies, the Prince family genealogy records, and family journals, gaining knowledge about how people lived and worked on the North Fork of Long Island. Over many months, I pieced together the remnants of a life that was at times ordinary, but also extraordinary, making the honor roll in school, learning to row a boat, all the while tending to the demanding work of keeping the beacon lit. So that's how my book opens. That's the introduction. Now, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. Mine is kind of a typical North Fork story. I grew up in Nassau County in Elmont. My husband and I raised our three sons in Syosset, which is kind of eastern Nassau County. But we always loved the North Fork. We went out to the North Fork on vacations. Eventually, we bought a summer home there. And when I retired, we moved to the North Fork year round, to Laurel, actually. I had worked my entire career with people with special needs. And for the last 22 years, I worked for Nassau BOCES as a vocational rehabilitation counselor, transitioning students from school to adult life. In that role, I did write a book, nonfiction, based on my work. So I had one book under my belt here when I set off on this one, although writing and getting nonfiction published is a very different process than fiction, which I learned along the way. When we settled out here in June of 2017, we settled here year round, the month I retired. I was on a mission to get involved and meet people. So by August, I was already a docent at Horton Point. I started reading everything I could find about lighthouses, and in particular, go to the next slide. The book that you see there, Don Bayless's book, Horton Point Lighthouse and Navigational Museum, really became my Bible. This book not only tells the story of how the lighthouse came about, the history of the lighthouse, how the Nautical Museum was developed, but also, where it started, but also it's where I first met Stella Prince. I hadn't known anything about her. We hadn't read anything about her in my preparation to be a docent until I read that book. I then decided I wanted to read about Stella Prince. I found it fascinating that a woman worked in this, what I knew to be rather demanding work. And I started reading everything I could find about women lighthouse keepers and discovered that Stella was overlooked by history. There really was nothing written about her, nothing published about her. And she really, I had to go to origin sources with the assistance of local historians and library researchers. I then proceeded to start to write her story, which was really previously untold. Okay, Horton Point today. Go to visiting Horton Point. Here we go. So I know a few of you have visited Horton Point, but I really want to invite everyone to come after hearing this talk and, if possible, reading the book. I think the library has the book, and you can get it on Amazon, of course. The book really brings the lighthouse to life. Even experienced docents have said to me, docents who've been there many years before me, that after reading the book, they felt enlivened at the lighthouse, knowing Stella's story. We will be opened again Memorial Day weekend. We're open Saturdays and Sundays from 11 to 4. As long as we have a volunteer up top, you can go up and climb the 27 steps to the top of the lighthouse and enjoy that amazing view and learn a lot about the history of the area. We also are doing private tours. If we have 10 people, it's $5 a person. And we then do specifically themed tours. Now, Stella themed tours have been particularly popular right now. We often have book groups who read the book as a group, and then they schedule a private tour for them, and we open up and do a Stella themed tour. We can do a Stella themed entire day, and after reading the book, you'll see most of her life was at the lighthouse, but her home that her father built was nearby, and Uncle Henry's store, which figures prominently in the book, is where the Southold Historical Museum office is located. So we have gone to those places, and even some groups have gone on to the cemetery with me. So next slide. Unique features of the lighthouse. So you'll see this gargoyle picture on the left. This was not the original gargoyle. These gargoyles are water spouts. They actually, when it's raining, the water actually spits out of the gargoyle's mouth. So it helps to keep the water off of the windows. Because as I'm sure you know, it's very important that the light be visible, and especially in bad weather. So this was one of the features they had. I recently was down in Pensacola, and that lighthouse was built around the same time, although it's a much bigger lighthouse, and they had the same gargoyles that we did. The federal government tended to do that. Lighthouses built around the same time with similar needs would often look alike. Now, Horton Point is a much smaller lighthouse than Pensacola, but it did share the same gargoyle. We have one of the gargoyles that we currently have on the water spouts are not the originals. The originals were stolen during a period when the lighthouse itself was not occupied, was not being used. The light was moved out to a kind of a flagpole, a metal stanchion. And during that time, people would hang out at the lighthouse local. If you talk to people around 80, they'll say this was the place they hung out. At that lighthouse, and it fell into disrepair. And so in the 1970s, a group from the Southold Historical got together, and the town wanted to destroy the lighthouse, and they wanted to re-enliven it. And so they took over making a museum on the main floor. The Coast Guard, who was then in charge of the tower, moved the beacon back into the tower. And so now the Historical Society is responsible for the museum, and town Southold Park District is responsible for the building and grounds. And it's a beautiful park, and I encourage you to come and see it whenever you. Okay, next slide is the map. I'm going to move down to the map. Okay, so this is a map that shows when Stella first came to the lighthouse. And I'm just going to read to you a couple of little bits from the book. This is actually the very beginning of the book. The big day is finally here. Little Stella Prince rushed through breakfast to watch Da load the last of their belongings from the cottage in Southold. They're moving to the lighthouse. When she sees Da tie the rocking chair on the wagon, she runs back inside and calls, "Hurry, Ma, Da's ready." Caroline takes one last look around their home on Prince Lane. They've had their share of troubles here, with George's struggles to find steady work, but she has happy memories too. Both her girls were born here. Caroline will miss the close ties she's forged with her neighbors, but she hopes this move will allow George to grow into the man she believes he is capable of becoming. Now, this, as you can see from this map, the distance from their home in Southold is only 2 miles, literally 2 miles to the lighthouse. But there was no road north of what we call the North Road. So they had to literally cut through a farmer's field. And I'll read you just a little bit from that passage about that experience. Across the road, they stop at a gate. There's a path behind it that leads through a field of potatoes. Doc climbs down, opens the gate, herds the horse through the opening, then secures the gate behind them before climbing back into the wagon. They repeat the tedious process at several gates, moving towards their goal through rows of sprouting vegetables. George rubs his shoulder, feeling a familiar ache in his back as they jostle along the rutted path, reminding him of his war wounds. "Are we there yet?" Stella asked. "Stella, sit still. If you don't settle down, Da's going to make us get out and walk." Stella's eyes widen in fear. She turns to Da and relaxes when she sees him smile. "She's excited, Mrs. P. I'm worried she'll fall with all her wiggling in this rutted trail," replies Ma. "I don't see how she could get loose." Da reaches over to Stella with one hand, ensuring her tight fit between him and Ma. When they stop at the next gate, Ma says, "Stella, listen. Do you hear the birds calling?" Stella holds still. She sees an osprey overhead and points to it. In the quiet, baby Lucy sits up and points towards the sky and says, "Burr, burr." Smiling, Ma says, "That's right, Lucy, bird." She repeats, exaggerating the sound for the little one to learn. "Ma, she's talking." "Yes, Stella, Lucy is learning to talk." So Stella and Lucy are these 2 little girls who grow up now at the lighthouse. They are only 17 months apart. And while they are very similar in their early childhood, they go on to become very different women. And I'll talk more about that later in this. You can move to the next slide, the cover of the genealogy book. So we are very fortunate. I was interested to hear how your historical society there in Connecticut is doing wonderful things. And we are very fortunate here on the North Fork that our rich history is preserved. Each of the 4 local libraries has a history section with staff members who are wonderful researchers. The Prince family, Stella's family of origin, was particularly well documented, as they are descendants of a 17th century whaling captain, John Prince, who settled in Southold from New Bedford, Massachusetts. Now, thanks to one of Stella's descendants, Helen Wright Prince. Helen Wright Prince married into the Prince family. She was born in 1912, died in 2013. She was a local school teacher who was the family historian. Now, Mrs. Prince wrote the Prince family history in this genealogy book. And now this is full not only of the factual story of who descended from whom, placing Stella as a 7th generation descendant of Captain John Prince, but it also includes family stories and photos, such as the story about Stella's sisters, Lucy's house burning down, pictures and drawings, and it's just a wonderful, rich resource. The Princes are are a family of note in Southold. Not only that, because they are the sons of the whaling captain, but many of the Prince family go on to be very successful and prominent members of town, of that growing town. Unfortunately, Stella's father seems to be from what we might call the poor side of the family tree. Although he did serve in the Civil War, re-enlisted after being injured in battle twice. However, when he returned to Southold, he had a difficult time adjusting to civilian life. Uh, Perhaps what we today might call some PTSD. And he did marry Carolyn Merrill, Stella's mother. She was the daughter of a highly successful Greenport butcher and property owner. So she came from a very comfortable family, and George was ill-equipped to provide for her in the manner in which she was accustomed. So George and Caroline had their struggles. They did have their two daughters, Stella and Lucy, and it appears that George came to rely on local brew to get through the monotony of day-to-day life. His drinking, though not uncommon among lighthouse keepers, eventually leads to his discharge from the lighthouse service due to his participation in an alcohol-fueled escapade. It's one of the things I write about in the book. Okay, next slide. We're going to go to Stella's picture, Stella Prince Terry. Here's our protagonist, young Stella, and Stella around the time of her wedding. Now, the picture on the left, we guesstimate, is Stella at about 16 years old. And the picture on the right, we think is part of her wedding picture. Yeah, I show later her with her husband. And she is 37 when she marries for the first time. Now, as I've said, she is a very unusual woman for her day. And I'm going to talk more about her sister Lucy, who follows a very traditional path, in a minute. But first, if you move on to the next slide, the letters from her mother's letters. So during the time when Stella's father was waiting for the lighthouse board's decision as to whether or not he could stay on after being charged with drunkenness, Stella, Caroline, and George moved back to the Southold cottage and left Stella in charge of the lighthouse. This is made clear by these letters. I was very fortunate that a researcher at the Southold Library, Dan McCarthy, located 3 letters that Stella's mother wrote to her during this very critical time period in the family history. So Stella's living at the lighthouse and taking care of things on her own for a period of several months. And the letters show that her father is supposed to be showing up and helping, but unfortunately, he's not reliable in this. So the letters show what a close and loving relationship Stella and her mother have, but they also show that her mother's enabling of her father's irresponsible behavior. In one of the letters, she urges Stella to visit friends on Block Island over the 4th of July. And she tells her that she, Caroline, will go to the lighthouse and be sure that it is tended to. So this is, again, another example of a family with a troubled family member who doesn't meet his responsibilities, and they step up and make sure that things are done as they should be. Not really helping anybody in the process, I fear. Anyway, so now we move on to the next picture, Lucy Prince Scott's home. Now, Lucy Merrill Prince Scott followed a traditional path for a woman of her day. She married at 18. She had 4 children by the time she was 28. She was widowed at 32, and she died at 44. Now, Lucy's story is very much what would be typical in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and very different from her sister Stella, who did not marry till 37. Now, I could not find Prince Lane. The genealogy book had said that Lucy's house was on Prince Lane, but there is no Prince Lane in Southold, and no one seemed to know how to find it. So I was on a walking history tour with Melissa Andrewski, one of our wonderful historians from the Southold Library. And we're walking down Mechanic Street, what's now called Mechanic Street. And Melissa points to this house and she says, so this house was owned by a woman. Her first house burned down, and she had something to do with Horton Point Lighthouse. She was the keeper's daughter or sister or something. And I was like, wait a minute, this is Lucy's house, this house that she had built after the other one burnt down? And Melissa's like, yes, I believe so. So I said, so this is Prince Lane? Melissa says, yes, this was known as Prince Lane back in the late 1800s. I then told the group the story about Stella and Lucy. I basically took over the tour. And I spoke about how they had a lightning rod. Lucy and her husband, Eddie Scott, had a lightning rod built in the back of their house after that first one burned down. People in the group were kind of searching for this lightning rod, and we never saw it, but we figured someone had taken it down over the years. As I was walking back to the car after the tour with a friend, I remembered that I had invented the lightning rod for the book. Children who live in lighthouses, it's reported that they felt safe because lighthouses, even though they are the tallest structure, they often have lightning rods. They normally have lightning rods to prevent them from burning down. And I just took that information and attached it to this. Now, this is what happens, and I've heard this from many authors, when you are writing historical or any sort of fiction, really, you can start to lose sight of what's real and what you've made up. And that's what happened in this case. When I was talking to people, I'm telling them the story, not really, that was really an invented part of the story, or not, at least not realizing it in the moment. So anyway, that's one of the things you kind of go through as an author. Okay, so move on to journals. Now, journals were a very important part of lighthouses and for people in general in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Now, the picture on the left that you see there is the original journal that Stella wrote in 1903. Now, I was very excited when I learned that these journals were available and I could take a look at them. And so I met with the historian at Southold Historical, Amy Folk, who went through the journal with me. Now, the way this works is that the left side of the journal is 31 lines, the month is at the top, and dates 1 through 31. Every single day, the keeper is required to note the weather conditions. The whole left side is strictly weather conditions, sorry. On the right side of the book, they would note anything of interest that might have happened. A delivery of supplies, a special event in their family, anything at all that they felt they needed to record. And I was very excited to see Stella's point of view, to see something that Stella found important. Unfortunately, Stella, during the 3 months that she wrote in the book, Stella never wrote anything except the weather. She really was not someone who felt comfortable, I guess, writing in the book. Now you can see on the right side, that is Stella's signature from the family Bible. One of the things that did stand out when I saw the journal is she had this very proper 8th grade schoolgirl's handwriting. And it was very different from Captain Ebbets, who she had served with at that time, who she was serving with, and who had written it before and after her. Now, you can go to the next slide that shows the keeper logs, different kinds of keeper's logs. Now, as I mentioned, it was common to not only for lighthouse keepers to keep logbooks, but also for people to journal. And I was very fortunate that Amy Folk, the historian, located George Prince's journal, so Stella's dad's journal, for the year 1888. It was in the archives at the Historical Society, just that 1 year. And so I was able to sit down and read it and learn about George's life and the world through George's eyes. So in 1888, George kept meticulous records of his egg-laying business, and hog slaughtering was a very important debt. He mentions his wife, who he refers to as Mrs. P, which is how I then have him refer to her in the book, He mentions her 3 times in the year. Twice that he sent her to the doctor to get medicine because he wasn't feeling well. He mentions his daughter Stella once, and that's that she has returned so he can go fishing. And he never mentions his daughter Lucy, who had his first grandchild that summer. He really shows himself to be a man of his day. He is the center of the world, and everyone is there to meet his needs. It's his life that matters. And this is how these women lived. Moving on to women keepers, as Ruth Ann mentioned, there were, we estimate, about 300 women keepers. Now, everyone at a lighthouse, just like in a farm family, everyone helped out. Everyone was expected to do their share. There was no official uniform for women keepers, although there was certainly an official, there was a militaristic organization, a very much an official uniform for the men. As far as we can determine, Stella wore the clothes of the day, which this picture shows a lighthouse keeper dressed for her work. And that is probably what Stella wore in the late 1800s when she was tending to the lighthouse. Now you have to remember that, like the women in the picture, Stella is dressed like that, and she is carrying up the 40-pound can of kerosene that has to be brought up at least twice a day at Horton Point to keep the lantern lit. She carries that up a 27-step circular stairway and 2 7-step fixed metal ladders. Now, this is not a typical woman. This is an unusually strong woman who can manage to do this as a regular part of her day. Twice a day, she's carrying up the kerosene during the times when she was alone at the lighthouse, and there were quite a few times that was the case. Now, the typical path for women to take over at lighthouses is that they were the wife or the daughter of the keeper, and the keeper became ill or in many cases passed away. It was not a given, however, that they would take over. Some local official from the local community would have to write to the lighthouse service and say what a good job the woman's doing and basically go to bat for her so that she could keep this job. So remember, this is where she lives. This provides their food. This provides their income. And now she's widowed, and usually in most people's case, most women's cases, they had children who could help with some of the work, at least. And in some cases, they might have a handyman, someone else who lives there. At some of the larger lighthouses, there would be more than one keeper, so there'd be an assistant keeper who could help, who would do their share of the work, of course. And in lighthouses in the South, before the Civil War, there would be slaves who would also work at the lighthouses. Okay, so next slide. So I have here, this is the earliest record of a woman working at the lighthouse that we know of. This was during the Revolutionary War, and as was typical, when her husband went to fight, she took over. The Coast Guard really prides itself on being a supporter of women working in lighthouses, and credits itself with that fact that working at a lighthouse was one of the first jobs that were non-clerical, that were open to women. And the Coast Guard did in fact pay women lighthouse keepers the same as the male keepers. So that was very unusual for the day, even unusual sometimes today. And in fact, Ida Lewis, who Ruth Ann mentioned at the beginning, Ida Lewis was the highest paid lighthouse keeper during some of the time that she served. So so women were well paid. However, lighthouse keeping was kind of seen as a domestic job. It was a lot of cleaning and scrubbing and dusting and keeping things in order. Twice a year, the lighthouse service would come and inspect, and it was a white glove inspection, and everything in the home and in the tower had to be spick and span, or the keeper would receive demerits, which could lead to firing. Now the Coast Guard, let's go on to the next slide. The Coast Guard did keep a list of women lighthouse keepers. And so when I finished writing the book, I had found that Stella was not even included on this official list of women keepers. And I just did not understand how that was possible. So I contacted the Coast Guard and eventually was routed to a historian in Washington, D.C. And his first response to me was, well, everybody helped out at the lighthouse. And I said, yes, I understand that. However, Stella was actually paid. I had newspaper articles that said she was commended by then President Theodore Roosevelt, and she was paid to do the job of acting assistant keeper. And he said, well, I cannot accept newspaper stories for that. I need documentation. So I responded, well, you're the Coast Guard. Let's get the documentation. So he said, no, the Coast Guard only took over lighthouses in 1939. And Stella was paid for her work between 1903 and 1904. So that I would have to track down her federal employment records, which would be housed at the National Archives in St. Louis. So that was around April of 2022 when I finished the book. And I then began emailing, snail mailing, and even phone called the National Archives in St. Louis during the course of that summer. And at some point I was told this isn't an emergency, and I get it. It's not an emergency. We've been waiting 120 years for this, but I really want it to happen. By September of 2022, I recontacted the Coast Guard historian and I said, I'm not getting anywhere. So he suggested that I contact my local librarian and have him get in touch with the National Archives in New York City, who might have Stella's records. I immediately reached out to the Manitowoc Rural Library historian, Jerry Matlovic, who had been very instrumental in obtaining the obituaries that of the Prince family that were a big help in researching for the book. And Jerry had been asking me about this book all the years I was writing it. So he was very excited to get a hand in it. And he sent an email out. And the next day, he got a response from an archivist in New York City, Kelly McEnany, who was very excited and said she just needed a little more information. I was able to provide that. And within, I think, 10 days, we had a response. And if you look at the list, go down to proof of employment. There we go, keep going, there we go. That is the very inauspicious list that proves that, in fact, Stella Prince was paid. At the very bottom, it says that she was employed by the federal government. Unfortunately, it lists her as a laborer. And I know from newspaper stories that she was, in fact, the acting assistant keeper. I forwarded this with, now I had four newspaper stories, 4 different stories saying that she was the acting keeper, back to Mr. Mullen, the historian at the Coast Guard. He said, based on this proof of employment form, he could add Stella to the official list of women keepers. Yay. However, he was finding it difficult technically to get her on this spreadsheet. If you go back up one slide, you'll see a sample of the spreadsheet. I've put on there a number of women keepers who you might be familiar with. Now, I had studied this spreadsheet very intensely. There were women who served for shorter periods of time. There were women who had the same job title as Stella, acting assistant keeper. There were women on there. There were 3 other women on there from Long Island who had served before Stella at the Oldfield Point Lighthouse. So it seemed very clear to me that this list, which initially had been assembled by 2 women researchers who wrote the seminal book on women lighthouse keepers, women who kept the lights. It's a mother-daughter research team, Mary and Candace Clifford. They gathered 138 names of women who served between 1828 and 1947. Now, it seemed very clear to me that Stella needed to be included on this list. And Mr. Mullen now said, yes, we will add her to the list. However, he would not put her in, he would not put a job title in for her because he wanted to put her in as a laborer. And I insisted that she needed to have the title of acting assistant keeper. Okay. Mr. Mullen had some technical difficulties with getting her on the list. By December, she still was not on the list. This is from October. In January, I contacted Mr. Mullen again and said, Stella's still not on the list. So he finally put her on the list, but she shared the line with the woman above her. It's an alphabetical list. So she shared the box with Patty Potter. And I got back to him and I said, Mr. Mullen, I'm really not happy about this. Stella has waited 120 years to get on this list. Can she please have her own line? So finally, by February 17th of 2023, Stella was officially on the list with her own name and box. And we were very, very pleased. However, she still does not have any job title next to her name because Mr. Mullen and I don't agree on what that should be. I am hoping that someday we will find that letter from President Roosevelt commending her to the Lighthouse Service. That's what Mr. Mullen would need to add, or that's what the Coast Guard would need. It's not personal, to add her job title. And hopefully someday that will check out. I am still searching for that. Okay, move on back to Stella. Move down. Proof of employment, Lighthouse nostalgia. That talks about, it's one of the newspaper articles that I located that talks about her commendation by then President Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, let's go on to George and Stella's. Now this, we assume that this is George and Stella's wedding photo, formal picture. George had been a cook on board ship, so maybe that's the reason. Orient is a very water-based community. George had a home on Navy Street, and he was, at that time when he was wooing Stella over the many years, he was the cook in the Orient General Store. He had been the cook on ship, and now as an older man, he was 51 when they finally married. Working class brides didn't wear white gowns in the early 1900s. They probably wore their best frock, whatever that might be. And weddings were held any day of the week except Sundays. Generally, it would be a very simple gathering of family at the local church, of course, maybe a couple of close friends, nothing extravagant, nothing like what we would expect a wedding to be currently. Now, move on to the next slide. You're looking at a new beginning. This is George and Stella's home. I had the opportunity to see in the inside of this house as it came on the market, and the realtor obtained permission from the owner to show me. It was kept in very much original condition. Even the front door did not open all the way because there was a hump in the floor. The house was literally sinking and created this, pushed up the floor, so the door couldn't open all the way. But it was wonderful to see it for me. It was the original sink that Stella had used. They had put indoor plumbing in, people after Stella and George. But it was the original sink in the kitchen, the stairs. Now, I spoke with the owner after viewing the house. She called me, and she told me a bit of local lore, which I then, at this point, I was pretty much done with the book, but I had to include this. And I'm going to read this one last passage that talks about Stella finally accepting the long-suffering George's proposal. And here we go. Uncomfortable at raising the topic, she finally dives in and says, George, I would like to accept your offer of marriage. He smiles, hopeful, as she continues. But I must say that having seen your home yesterday, I could not consider living in a one-room cabin. George is crestfallen at her pronouncement. He steps away and then responds, if I were to build you a larger home, might you consider my proposal? Surprised at his willingness to take on such an undertaking, Stella says, yes, I think I would, but George puts his hand on hers, imploring, another but. I think a small one this time, she says, smiling. Okay, he responds. It's just that when we all visited yesterday, I saw the need for, I'd like a two-seater outhouse. George smirks. Stella continues, like Lou had in Sag Harbor. Well, that's easy. Not that I see the necessity, but I will build that first. Now, if you look at this picture, you see the little piece of the house in the back. That was the whole house when Stella first saw it. George lived in that one-room house. There was a porthole in the ceiling and a ladder that went up to his bedroom upstairs. Local lore says that in order to marry Stella, he then built the front part of the house, which was a living room and dining room, and a beautiful stairway that went up to 2 more bedrooms. In fact of the two-seater outhouse, the two-seater outhouse was there when the owner at that time first bought the house in the 1960s. It did blow down after that, but it was there, and she was told it was built by George Terry. I was well into writing the book at this point, essentially almost done. And when I saw the house had a two-seater outhouse, I was shocked because I had already much earlier in the book, given Stella's sister Lucy a two-seater outhouse. I have no idea where I got that from. I don't really know anything about outhouses, but when I was writing about Lucy's house in Sag Harbor, which is a very fancy area, I wanted to put in some fancy things. And since she had 3 toddlers at the time, 3 preschoolers, I figured she could use a 2 bathroom. So I gave her a 2-seater. And then it turned out Stella had a 2-seater. So I think they're kind of rare from what I've been told. And I think just amazing. And again, these are the kinds of things that happened when I was writing the book or throughout my research for the book. That's something, some odd little fact would then present as current for Stella's life. And it was just really wonderful. So as I've learned through what is now a 6-year journey with Stella, her story continues as Stella and George's home in Orient was demolished this year. I don't disagree that it was not livable. However, I have asked the new owner to salvage anything of value, and there were many donations made to the Oyster Ponds Historical Society from the home, things that Stella and George had left. I was really hoping that there would be some hidden compartment found in the floor or the walls, and the letter commending her to the lighthouse to the acting assistant keeper would be unearthed, but that hasn't happened. Okay, move on to the next slide. We're now at Willow Hill Cemetery on the main road. This is Lucy and Stella's headstones. Lucy and Stella are buried side by side at Willow Hill Cemetery. They are included in the Merrill family plot. That's her mother's family. Her mother and her father are also buried right next to them. Neither of their husbands is buried with them. I never was able to find any record of Lucy's husband, Eddie Scott's death. Eddie Scott was an Irish immigrant, and at that time, he was not allowed to own property. And although he did become a successful jeweler and supported his family well, he died anonymously, I fear. He didn't really carry much weight in that society. Stella's husband, George, is buried in the Terry family plot out in Orient. The Terrys are also a prominent family on the North Fork, like the Princes are. Now, Stella's father, George, is buried in the Merrill family plot. I kind of see this as the ultimate emasculation, being buried in your in-laws plot, particularly since there's a huge presence of Prince family buried just down the road. They have a very big presence in the cemetery down the road, but George was not included with that. He was with the Merrills. Okay, next slide. So as I indicated, we're going to Stella's favorite. So these are poems that were donated to the Historical Society summer of 2023. Summer of 2022, I'm sorry. Now, these poems came from the Richards family. The Richards family lived across the street from George and Stella's home in Orient. Now, Stella predeceased her husband. She died at 60. And George continued to, even though he was quite a bit older, he lived quite a few more years. And one assumes that the Richards family helped him in his old age. We don't really know, but he left that house and its contents to the Richards family. At some point, they sold both homes and moved to New Hampshire. The granddaughter of that family died last year, And her daughter is going through the attic of her mother's home, and she comes across a trunk that says Prince on it. And in it, she finds this book. It is a magazine, Harper's Weekly. And in it, Stella has glued a number of poems. And I pull out these two, took pictures of these two in particular, because they added weight to my interpretation of Stella's life. The fact that she would choose to keep poems, one is called Only a Drunkard, and the other is Intemperance. And they speak to the fact that her father's drinking had a huge impact on her life. In the next slide, we see a poem that she also saved called The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter. And this is something I really know as a sea shanty. A lighthouse keeper marries a mermaid. But, you know, it's interesting to me that Stella's cut these poems out of someplace else that she read, glued them to an old magazine. And this takes recycling to a level that beyond what anything I've ever done, certainly. But it was not atypical in the early 1900s. Paper was precious. And so you didn't get rid of anything. And so Stella was reusing paper, a magazine, to keep as a scrapbook of things she wanted to save. And it's wonderful that these things were found and saved by the Richards family and then donated. So I'm very happy to see them. Now, this also points out the difference between Stella's side of the Prince family and her Uncle Henry and cousin Edith, whose leather-bound, gold-edged journals are currently housed in the Suffolk Historical Museum. And that's where they wrote about their daily life. And Stella cut out and stuck poems to an old magazine. Anyway, next slide, which is really the end of our talk here. Now, I call this Postcards from the Grave. I'll tell the story about this. So I was invited to speak at an organization that currently is housed in this church. This is the Methodist church that Stella and her sister and mother attended for most of her life. Now, when I was invited to speak there, I wasn't sure if Stella and George had married there. I couldn't remember if I'd ever read anything that really said that's where they were married. And I wanted to be sure. So I contacted the historian at Southold and asked her, do we have any record of Stella being married at the Methodist church? Would make sense that she would have been, but do we know? And she says, as a matter of fact, just a month ago, we received an anonymous donation left on the counter in the office. And in it, there was this postcard. And the director looked at the postcard. On the front is that picture of the Methodist church. And on the back is a message from Stella. It is the only thing I've ever seen that Stella wrote, other than the weather. And she says, the first line, "This is the church where George and I were married." I get chills every time I see it and say it. And as someone has said to me, I've always been ambivalent, that I wondered if Stella would really want her story told. But having seen this postcard, I think that she's talking to us from the grave and saying, yes, I want people to know about my life. And so I am telling her story. So while the book ends, you can go to the next slide. That's the beach below the lighthouse. While the book ends with George and Stella's engagement, Stella's story continues as new artifacts continue to be discovered, as I just said. And I'm hoping that someday her letter of commendation to be the acting assistant keeper will turn up. And I'll surely be contacting the Coast Guard historian to add her job title to the list. I want to thank you very much for your time and your interest. If there are any questions that you might have, I'm happy to answer them. I think you could put them in the chat. The book is available on Amazon. If you'd like to read it, I think the local library has it. I know coastal libraries in New York do, but I'm not sure about Connecticut. I should have asked Mara. It can be purchased at local bookstores on the North Fork, Burton's, and Greenport, and a book place in Riverhead, and many locations, of course, at the Lighthouse, a number of locations on Long Island. So yeah, that's Stella's story. And the last slide was just the dates that the Lighthouse will be open. So if anybody has any questions, if I can answer them, I will certainly try. And that's the deal. Thank you very much.